to Bangalore Cantonment, today's theme. Well, on the elimination of Tipu Sultan, when the British established their protectorate, over the state of Mysore on the signing of the subsidiary alliance. Initially, the military base was established at Srirangapatna, but the very humid weather over there and malarial attacks compelled the British to shift the station to Bangalore, because even the weather was very salubrious and very congenial for the whites. Well, on shifting the troops to Bangalore, they were first located in the fort. But it did not last long. They were compelled to shift to a new site. The compulsion was one. There were two factors at least. Space constraint in the cantonment, in the fort. And secondly, a very strong reason for them to shift to a better space away from the Peta region, It was the close contact or direct contact with the natives which the British wanted to avoid. The troops were having direct contact with the natives. And here, worrisome for them was the consumption of deleterious spirits and drugs by the troops. That was easily available. They were all locally brewed spirits, and of course it was much cheaper than the liquor that was imported from Britain, and it was easily affordable insofar as the soldiers were concerned. So this was in fact a major concern because it was affecting the health of the soldiers. And Madras government was indeed alarmed by the developments that were taking place. Then the other major concern, of course, was as to why they came over to Bangalore was Bangalore was strategically located in the southern peninsula. It's no wonder Bijapur Sultans, the Marathas, the Mughals had held control over Bangalore. And later, when the British also came, by then at least, several battles had been fought for Bangalore. And when the British came, all these factors, salubrious climate, health of the soldiers, and of course, the strategic location became very, very important. In 1807, William Bentinck, who was then the governor of Madras, negotiated with the Maharaja, Krishnaraja Wadayar III, for land to station the troops. The East India Company then commissioned John Blackiston to select the site, make a survey, prepare the plans for the cantonment. And the process commenced once the land was granted by the Maharaja. It was the largest cantonment in southern India. It came into being in 1809. The force was collected from various parts of Madras Presidency, and they were stationed in the Bangalore Cantonment. In the creation of this urban space, what could be discerned was colonial hegemony that got strongly etched in the cantonment. And well, it was typical of what Antonio Gramsci's definition of hegemony, a form of control exercised by a dominant class. That was what happened in the cantonment. So the basic premise of the hegemonic theory is that, I quote, the rule over others is not merely by force, it is also by ideas. So there were ideas as well as force which went in founding of the cantonment. Colonial hegemony was rather striking here. Well, speaking of the founding of this new space, I did find 3 spaces which have been identified by Henry Lefferner. He is a Marxist philosopher and a sociologist. So I felt it fit the kind of space that came to be created in the colonial cities as well as in the cantonments. These 3 spaces, the perceived space, the conceived space, and the lived space. Perceived space, it is more ideological. So there were ideological notions. There were also economic and social motives also in the creation of this space. Predominant, of course, was ideological insofar as the cantonment was concerned. The troops that were stationed here were under the direct control of the British, and the troop consisted of their own men. Naturally, this provided a very safe enclave for the white population. Power came to be exercised by them militarily as well as politically. Interestingly, the British idea of themselves as the imperial people, charged with governance over others, was not a new idea. It was not just to be found in the colonies in Afro-Asia. The strong belief they had in racial segregation. Racial segregation to keep themselves away from the noxious environment of the natives. Besides that, this was also dictated by the concern for safety, more so after the 1857 revolt, and there was a panic in the British. So their safety was also important, and the cantonments served this purpose as well. So these notions which were perceived by them were conceived in this new space. So in the conceived space, all these ideas, notions came to be transmitted. They were translated through networks of knowledge, acquisition of land, then planning, designing the space. So the underlying idea, of course, was political dominance by way of military strength. In such projects were involved racial theorists. They were the urban planners, they were the designers, architects, scientists, medical men, legalists, who were involved in these projects. In the planning of the cantonment too, racialism as well as miasma ಅಂದರೆ ಸೋಂಕಿನ ಅಭೆ ದುರ್ಗಂಧ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಸೊ ನೇಟಿವ್ ಏರಿಯಾಸ್, ಸ್ಥಳೀಯರು ಇರುವಂಥದ್ದೆಲ್ಲ ಇಂಥ ಪ್ರದೇಶಗಳೇ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಇದು ಒಂದು ಥಿಯರಿ ಆಗು ಡೆವಲಪ್ ಆಗೋಕ್ಕೆ ಆರಂಭ ಆಯಿತು. ಏಕೆಂದರೆ ಇಂಗ್ಲೆಂಡ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಏಟಿಯಲಾಜಿಕಲ್ ಸ್ಟಡೀಸ್ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು, ಯಾಕೆಂದರೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಕಡೆ ಸೋಂಕುಗಳು ಎಪಿಡೆಮಿಕ್ಸ್ ಸುಮಾರು ಬ್ರೇಕೌಟ್ ಆಗ್ತಾಯಿತ್ತು, ಯುರೋಪ್ನಲ್ಲೂ ಬ್ರೇಕೌಟ್ ಆಗ್ತಾಯಿತ್ತು. ಸೊ ಅಂಥ ರೋಗಗಳಿಗೆಲ್ಲನೂ ಸ್ಟಡೀಸ್ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು ರೋಗಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಆರಂಭ ಆಯಿತು. ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಅಂತ ಕಂಟ್ರೀಸ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದಾಗ ಈ ಮಯಾಸ್ಮಾಟಿಕ್ ಥಿಯರಿ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು ಸ್ಟ್ರಾಂಗ್ ಆಗಿ, ಏಕೆಂದರೆ ಇವರಿಂದನೇ ಎಲ್ಲ ರೋಗಗಳು ಬಿಳಿಯರಿಗೆ ಹರಡಿಕೊಳ್ಳುತ್ತೆ ಅನ್ನೋ ಒಂದು ಭಯ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಇತ್ತು. So these were the attitudes that came to be strongly etched in the planning of the new spaces. So what could also be discerned here is how they perceived themselves. Adu a conceived space nalli we, the whites, the British and the imperialists, the colonizers. Most important, it came to be dictated not just political, but it was also hygienic factor that ruled it. So the cantonment had all the trappings of colonialism as well as racialism, and of course this was quite evident in the way the urban place came to be spaced or planned. So many of the cantonments, they did not remain merely garrisons like the Bangalore Cantonment. It was both a military as well as a civil station. The cantonment was an entity because it was separated from the peta. ಬರಹಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ನೋಡುವಂಥದ್ದು ಇಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಇನ್ಫೆಸ್ಟೆಡ್ ವಿತ್ ಮಂಕೀಸ್ ಅಂತ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಇಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ರಾದರ್ ವೈಲ್ಡ್. So it was untraversable for people. It was not so easy for natives to enter into the cantonment. This was the idea, not to allow the natives to enter into this space. Then, of course, the maidan for the drill and exercises of the troops. And of course, the artillery, batteries, regiments of cavalry, infantry, mounted cavalry, sappers, miners, then of course supply and transport corps, all these. And most important was the Bangalore Rifle Volunteers, BRV annotadu. So unlike the organic nature of the pre-colonial cities, which were more sinuous cities because there were several bends and curves, very narrow lanes. Unlike that, the white colonies had spacious rectilineous straight lines. And this was a kind of an urban ideal that was brought into India in the new spaces that came to be created by them. So unlike the native localities, the civil lines of the whites were planned on with mathematical precision, and racial arrogance really signaled the planning that was undertaken insofar as the cantonment was concerned. This was quite evident in the networks that came to be established, the pathways, the transit, rail transit facilities, particularly communication links, sewer as well as water systems. So another space where racialism, segregation and miasmatic theory came to be strictly applied was the buildings. This is a very important element we find in the colonial policy of exclusion, the buildings. If we take up the two major types of buildings, bungalows as well as public buildings. Bungalows and these public buildings were both symbols of imperial power in all the new spaces created by them, because they were some kind of islands of Englishness. That was the feature that we come across. Bungalows were located in large acres. So the houses had very high compounds, tall gateways, lengthy driveways, big portico, a very big veranda attached to the house. This kind of a spatial symbol represented the status of the person who occupied that building. It also spoke of the insularity of the British in India. The public buildings, they were also massive sized. So these public buildings actually became symbols of imperialism. So Indic features, ನಮ್ಮ ಇಂಡಿಜಿನಸ್ ಫೀಚರ್ಸ್ ಏನಾದರೂ ಆರ್ಕಿಟೆಕ್ಚರಲ್ ಫೀಚರ್ಸ್ ಅಂದರೆ ತುಂಬ ಕಡಿಮೆ, ಕನಿಷ್ಠ ಇರ್ತಿತ್ತಷ್ಟೆ, ಮಿನಿಮಮ್ features. So this is how the ideas came to be conceived in the space. But in the actual lived space, it was an experience for the whites as well as the natives. It was in the lived space that racial segregation was highly visible. Segregation was physical, social, and cultural exclusion of the natives from the whites. There were codes of conduct for maintaining Englishness. So this was, they had their own codes of conduct. In the planned areas where the whites settled, interesting features were promenades, central thoroughfares, tree-lined streets, bungalows, churches, clubs, race courses, golf courses, cinema halls, cemeteries, burial grounds, exclusive cemeteries. White residential localities ನಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ನೇಮ್ಸ್. ಇವತ್ತು ಇದೆ ರಿಚ್ಮಂಡ್ ಟೌನು, ಎಲ್ಲನೂ ಸುಮಾರು ಇದ್ದಾವೆ, ಆಸ್ಟಿನ್ ಟೌನು, ರಿಚ್ಮಂಡ್ ಟೌನ್ ಅಂತ ಸೆವ್ರಲ್ ಆಫ್ ದೀಸ್ ಟೌನ್ಸ್, ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ names of certain individuals there, and the streets had military nomenclature: Brigade Road, Cavalry Road, Artillery Road, Infantry Road, and these of course still exist, continue to exist. The native localities on the other hand were densely populated ones. They were very narrow laned, highly congested, and these areas also one could identify a class divide, the rich and the poorer sections. The rich among the Tamils, they lived further down the South Parade Road, today's MG Road, and these were the migrants mainly from North and South Arcot, and that region was known as Muthucheri, Keri ಅನ್ನುವಂಥ. ಮತ್ತು ಶ್ರೀಮಂತರಾಗಿದ್ದಂಥ ಸುನ್ನಿ ಮುಸ್ಲಿಮ್ಗಳು, ಅವರು ಕಂಟೋನ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಏರಿಯಾನೇ, ಅಫ್ಕೋರ್ಸ್ ನೇಟಿವ್ ಏರಿಯಾಸ್ನಲ್ಲಿ, ಬಟ್ ಕೆಲವರು ಶ್ರೀಮಂತರಾಗಿದ್ದಂಥವರು ಸೌತ್ ಪರೇಡ್ ಮತ್ತು ಬ್ರಿಗೇಡ್ ರೋಡ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲವು ಶಾಪ್ಸ್ ತುಂಬ ಕಡಿಮೆನೇ. ಅವರು ಹೆಚ್ಚಾಗಿ ಹ್ಯಾಕ್ನಿ ಕ್ಯಾರೇಜಸ್, ಅವಾಗೆಲ್ಲ ಹ್ಯಾಕ್ನಿ ಕ್ಯಾರೇಜಸ್ ಇರ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಿತ್ತು, ಅದರದ್ದು ಮತ್ತು ಲೆದರ್ ಬಿಸ್ನೆಸ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದಂಥವ್ರು ಅವರೆಲ್ಲನೂ. ಶಿಯಾ ಮುಸ್ಲಿಮ್ಸ್ mainly horse dealers, they were in the Arab lines, and ಇದು ಇವತ್ತಿನ ಜಾನ್ಸನ್ ಮಾರ್ಕೆಟ್ ಅಂತಿದೆ, ಅದರ ಸಮೀಪ ಇರುವಂಥ ಲೈನ್ಸ್ನ ಅರಬ್ ಲೈನ್ಸ್ ಅಂತ ಕರೀತಾ ಇದ್ರು. ಬಟ್ ದಿಸ್ ವಾಸ್ cantonment was also a service, there was a service economy, and for this service economy it was the Muslims and the Tamils who contributed significantly in the service economy. If in the English occupied region good drainage, piped water and so on, sanitation and facilities were available,